Hi, good afternoon. Are we ready to roll?
Absolutely, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome to all the panelists and the participants. My name is Ahmed Isak. I'm going to facilitate the session this afternoon, the focus of which the theme is building a resilient and sustainable higher education system, particularly the role of higher education in the light of what has been defined as new normal. I have asked the panelists to reflect in their presentations on what this new normal means and whether we should accept it, which seems to be accepted very uncritically. In terms of process, I'm going to be assisted by Patrick Fish as the moderator, and I will explain his role in a moment. I will introduce the four panelists, who I'm sure don't require an introduction, briefly in the sequence in which they're going to be speaking. First, Salim Badat, who is a research professor of higher education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. As most of you will know, Salim was previously the Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University, served as the CEO of the Council on Higher Education, and more recently was the Program Director for Higher Education at the Mellon Foundation. Rajani Naidu, who's the Professor of Higher Education Management at the University of Bath, and the Director of the International Center for Higher Education Management, as well as the UNESCO Chair for Higher Education Management. I'm sure many of you would have come across Rajani, at least those of you who had previously registered or are in the process of registering for the DBA that Bath offers and which is hosted at Nelson Mandela University. Sorry, Salim is going to speak about the purpose of the university, the role of the university in the context of what it means to be resilient and sustainable. Rajani is going to speak about competition and collaboration in higher education. The third panelist is Professor Zebulon Vilakazi, who I thought was the Vice Chancellor-elect, but apparently at WITS they don't elect Vice Chancellors, they appoint them. He's the Vice Chancellor-designate at the WITS University starting on the 1st of January. Zebulon, as those of you who know him, is a physicist by training, focusing on nuclear and high energy physics, and serves on many international panels relating to nuclear physics. And Zebulon is going to speak about the mega challenges of the 21st century, specifically, I think, linked to issues with the digital economy and society. And the last speaker, last but not least, is Diane Parker, who is the Deputy Director General for Higher Education. Di, as you may know, prior to becoming a bureaucrat, was an academic at the then University of Natal. And I have no idea what Di is going to speak about in relation, in terms of government protocol. It's usually kept a top secret. They only announce when they speak what they're going to say. So I presume she's going to either lay down the line about where higher education should be going, or she's going to give us some other story. Each of the panelists has 10 minutes to speak, after which we will open up for discussion, questions and answers and comment. The participants, as you know, you have no direct link in terms of engaging directly with the panelists. There's a chat room in which you can pose your questions and answers. And between Patrick and I, Patrick is the moderator. He will communicate questions to the panelists who would also have access and will be able to see the questions you are posing. We're likely to have 2 rounds in terms of time of questions and answers and discussion. And I would welcome and encourage you to put as many questions and as difficult questions as you have for the 4 panelists. Thank you. And with that, Salim, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this symposium. I want to address 3 questions on the theme of building a resilient and sustainable higher education system. The first question is resilience and sustainability for what precisely? This could be a trite question, but I pose it because I'm not persuaded by the way the question for this session has been framed by USAf. Second, is there a shared understanding among the state, universities, academics, and students on the purposes of universities and what transformation entails? And third, what are the implications for the resilience and sustainability of our universities in the absence of a shared understanding of the purposes of universities, what universities are for, and what transformation is meant to mean substantively. So let's start with resilience and sustainability. I take resilience to be about the capacity of a university to deal with economic, social, and other challenges, stresses, and pressures, to cope with change, and to continue to develop in a way that maintains its integrity, purposes, and goals. Okay. Secondly, sustainability, in contrast to resilience, is about a university's ability to undertake its current functions, its roles and activities, to address its requirements that it needs to do so, and to do so in a way that does not compromise intellectually, organizationally, environmentally, and financially its ability to do so in the future. We could take many decisions right now that is going to compromise a whole lot of important things. And I think we should be very careful about that. Okay, so the question of resilience and sustainability, working with those notions of resilience and sustainability, the question of what is it for should alert us to at least four things, I think. Firstly, that issues of resilience and sustainability are contextual and institutionally specific. They mean different things for different institutions, and they must mean something different for universities as compared to the health department, or home affairs, as an example. Secondly, I want to suggest that you cannot plan for every contingency. And we should be very cautious. It's something I'm afraid of. We should be very cautious of throwing money and spawning an army of resilience and sustainability consultants who come from the big companies and will make us more resilient and sustainable. I've seen this in the past. Some of you are smiling, and I'm fearful that this may happen again. Some bland solution of how to become more resilient and sustainable. I just also want to say, these risks being mitigated cost money. Anyone who knows how we've had to spend money to cope with ESCOM and so on will tell you they can cost millions and millions, if not tens of millions, to make yourself more resilient and sustainable. So tread with caution. Thirdly, I want to suggest that resilience and sustainability cannot be entirely about institutional survival at all costs, in the process of which the institution becomes eroded, corroded, hollowed out, a shadow of what it's meant to be. Survival at all costs. So lastly, I want to suggest that resilience and sustainability are connected fundamentally with sustaining and reproducing the integrity, the core purposes and functions and activities of the university, to its transformation as necessary and to its ongoing development. Okay, that's why we want resilience and sustainability. It's about discharging the core purposes, right? So if that really is the challenge, my second question then is about, but do we have a shared understanding as academics, as students, as universities, as the state, about what is the purposes of our universities? What are they for? And what does transformation entail? It's a term that I'm about to stop using, or put only in inverted commas, because I don't really know any longer this word called transformation, what it really means, okay? So over the past 2 years, as part of my Mellon work and other work, I've visited and spoken with many administrators, scholars, and students from numerous universities. And my impression is that we need to have a deep conversation on, we need to develop a shared understanding on, and we need to forge a social compact on what is the university, what are its educational and social purposes, and its core goals and functions in a society like South Africa. And I want to suggest, having gone through many policy documents which I've been familiar and I read over and over again, like the white paper of 1997, that this question of what the purposes of a university are in South Africa is a question that has been largely elided post-1994. We haven't really confronted this question. We imagine we have, but I'm sorry, we haven't. Okay? And I think the 2015-2016 student protests raised these questions again. Fundamentally, they are about what are these universities for? What are their purposes? The COVID pandemic, the online turn, the discourse of the new normal are raising these questions even more acutely, in my view. What are universities for? Okay. And I think we will be well served if we start to give attention to some of these questions, while we, of course, also busy ourselves to trying to become resilient and sustainable. Right? So in the new issue of Transformation Journal, which has just come out in this week, I note that there are two kinds of new normal discourse. The one is a trite kind, to be honest. It simply describes the new realities like social distancing, wearing of masks, the digital turn. Okay, that's the new normal. I don't have a problem with that. But there's another kind of discourse, if you read carefully, which notes various conditions and developments that have arisen because of COVID-19. And those developments that particular actors favor are being normatively promoted as the new normal. So if I like the online turn and I have a kind of fascination with technology, then I promote that, the new normal. It's the online turn, right? Now, for me, this is very reminiscent of South Africa in the early 80s, when a discourse of skill shortages became a metaphor for paving the way for economic and social structuring that was favored by large capital. That's exactly what happened in the 1980s. Right? So I don't want to go into the details of quotes that I have from a research dean who claims that higher education has been radically changed. All I want to say, what has radically changed? With respect, tell me what has radically changed. I know one of the two things has changed, but what has radically changed? So these claims are being made, and I want to suggest these claims about radical changes and the radical changes that are coming and so on need to be very critically interrogated before we all jump onto this bandwagon where we imagine COVID has brought about all these kind of changes. In the Transformation article, I argue there have been no structural changes. Even the conjunctural changes have been somewhat marginal. So be careful of these grand claims about structural and conjunctural changes of a massive kind under COVID. So one of the officials of a university says a good outcome of this pandemic is the recognition of the value of distance learning. Now I want to respond, and I do respond in this Transformation article to say, be cautious about online learning too. And I also call for its effective regulation before we spawn a whole lot of universities going online now. And all in the name of access, success, and equity. I'm not persuaded. I don't think the digital turn, the online turn, will bring about greater access, success, and equity. Because higher education fundamentally is about the sociality of learning, and there are psychosocial and affective dimensions of learning. On its own, the digital turn, online learning, is not going to create conditions for success, access, and opportunity for kids who come from working class and rural impoverished families. They need to be in contact institutions where they are well taken care of. So all this glib talk about how it's all going to bring about equity, access, and success, spare me that, please. I think this is a lot of marketing nonsense than in anything real. Okay. And the digital transformation is now about transformation. I think we need to interrogate that very carefully. These kind of loose, glib claims being made by our own university officials about how the world has changed and how we are better positioned now to pursue access, equity, and success. I can quote all these officials because I have done so in part in the Transformation article. Okay. And so just one or two words on transformation in this context. Transformation really transformation really functions as a performative in our society and in higher education in South Africa. It's the ideological cement that Wallerstein speaks about. It's intended to bind together liberals, radicals, and everyone, right? The ideological cement. So transformation has come to mean everything to everyone. What is a reform is described as transformation. What is a little improvement is transformation. So it's hard to know what is transformation anymore. Linda Chisholm has pointed this out also. Okay. So to paraphrase someone I really like, Sarah Ahmed, and who writes about diversity, transformation talk is ubiquitous. Like her integration of the concept of diversity, we may want to ask what role the idea of transformation plays in South Africa. What recedes? What goes away when transformation becomes the key viewpoint? What is obscured when we constantly talk about transformation? And I want to suggest lots of important things are being obscured that we are not honestly confronting. Okay, so a discussion also on transformation, in my view, is urgent and long overdue. So last point, what are the implications for resilience and sustainability of not having a shared understanding of what universities are for and about transformation? So first point I'll make, our institutions are fragile institutions. Every university I know, even the ones that appear to be the most solid, you can see how fragile they are. Secondly, our universities have had huge expectations placed on them. When the overall political economy, a point Liz Langer made yesterday, has not been supportive, we need to be honest about that. When the DHET has been unsuccessful in many aspects of steering, and that's quite clear also, and our universities are not adequately funded. Okay. Some universities are still recovering from the turmoil and the challenges of the student protests. I see that when I go there. Right? So I don't want to go into the details of what the consequences could be. I think we can explore that. I simply want to say that unless we have a social compact around what our university is for, what transformation really means, I think our universities are going to remain four things. Our universities are going to be remaining socially divided, conflict-ridden, turbulent, and extremely fragile institutions in the post-COVID period. And if we simply busy ourselves with resilience, sustainability, we're going to miss yet another opportunity, I think, post-student protests, to really come to grips with some very difficult issues, which need mediation both by university leadership and the state. And we need to start doing these things honestly, you know. I think there's a lot of, in inverted commas, dishonesty in how we confront things in higher education, especially in the light of a macro-political economy that does not sustain this wonderful transformation project that we want to. Last point, if we imagine that sustainability and resilience is about funding, or even largely about funding, about technologies associated with the so-called fourth industrial revolution, or about technical or technocratic changes, then I think we are entirely misconceiving what's really involved in building resilient and sustainable universities. My last point, ultimately those two things, resilience and sustainability, are connected with and depend on decolonization and ongoing transformation of our universities and higher education. We don't transform, we don't decolonize, we are not going to be resilient and sustainable institutions. That's my last word. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salim. Rajani, straight to you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for this opportunity to engage on all these important issues. And perhaps maybe I start off by saying it's very hard to predict accurately all the characteristics of the new normal. But I would like to highlight some patterns. First, the pandemic has shown us how fragile and interconnected we are as human beings. It has revealed the tensions between hyper-individualism and society as a collective, between competition and collaboration, and between the market and other forms of coordination. In some ways, it has revealed the very best of human nature, but at the same time, it has reinforced the effects of predatory capitalism on some of the most vulnerable in our communities. So to follow on from what Professor Badatta said, it's not just a question of how to make our universities more sustainable and more resilient, but how do we ensure that higher education contributes to more sustainable and equal societies. And here I would like to focus on what I see as one of the major barriers to this vision. And in my own research, I've termed this the competition fetish in higher education. The idea of competition has become so powerful because it encapsulates what the anthropologist P.S. Smith has called mind snares. And these are rituals that actually trap the mind. For example, this very deeply held belief that competition is natural, that competition is fair, and that competition gives us more choice, and competition drives up quality. And of course, competition is very, very seductive. We all fear shame, and we all crave fame. So the competition fetish operates at its most powerful in the Anglo-Saxon countries, but like colonization, it travels both to the east and to the south, including African and South African universities, where it manifests in different ways. So scholarly competition, market competition, government-sponsored excellence contests, and ranking all interact in a very large number of ways. So I think it's very important to explore how competition as a governance tool, as a management tool, as a way of life can actually move us away from developing resilience and sustainability. And I want to just present 3 very quick examples. Firstly, different forms of competition interact to reinforce old hierarchies and channel new forms of inequality. And this leads to what I have called the combined and uneven development of higher education worldwide. Second, global rankings and the battle for world-class status swallow absolutely huge amounts of financial and administrative resources. More importantly, this undermines the diversity within systems of higher education. All institutions come under pressure to mimic the most powerful ones, and many institutions become dysfunctional shadows of the elite. What this leads to is higher education systems that are not differentiated by mission or valued by mission, but instead we have stratified systems that are stratified by status, by resources, and by social disadvantage of the student population. Fourth, the opening up of market forces and research has led to the intertwining of universities with very large corporations. Without important safeguards, this leads to extensive public investment in research, but the privatization of profit that comes from publicly funded research. More worryingly, research for the public good is undermined. An important example here is the University of Oxford's collaboration with AstraZeneca in relation to the COVID vaccine. While the pharmaceutical giant has pledged not to make a profit during the pandemic, the actual licensing agreement has not been made public. So we have no assurances that the technology, the data, the know-how will be shared to enable all countries around the world to manufacture the vaccine themselves. So the struggle, we still have a struggle that I think universities must actually lead on as well, of making this sort of research a public good, and not just a national public good, but a global public good. So how do we move beyond this competition fetish in higher education to develop more resilient, sustainable, and equitable institutions and societies? And I think the first thing that I want to say is that not all competition is negative. We know that traditional research competition has resulted in huge intellectual advances. But I think what we need to do is we need to challenge this doxa that different types of competition can always be solved to solve all the problems of higher education. We need to decide which aspects of higher education may benefit from what types of competition. We need to decide which functions of higher education should be protected from competition. So, for example, I'm not advocating that we siphon off all the funding from our most elite and research-intensive universities, as these have built up capacity over very long periods of time, and you don't want to pull these down and then start again. But what I am suggesting is that we need to find a better balance to develop a truly diversified system of higher education. And that requires new thinking about policies and funding. And also, I think, given the resources that these universities consume, they need to supplement their prestige function, their function of joining the world-class global elite with the responsibility for building capacity in national systems of higher education as a whole. Most importantly, I think we need to challenge the way in which competition has just become so powerful that other ways of organizing are seen as really, really old-fashioned, or as anti-democratic, or as inefficient. One of the most important insights from the pandemic is the importance of having a collective vision and collective action. So I think I would like to end really by raising the issue of how do we actually balance competition, coordination, planning, and university autonomy to build a new social compact that was brought about initially, the minister spoke about it, and then the CEO of University of South Africa and Professor Badat as well. So how do we bring together all these different forms of organizing in order to build this new social compact that we really need and require? Thank you.
Thank you, Rajani. And without much ado, Zebulon, you next. You've got slides, Zebulon.
Yes, can you hear me? I'm just gonna share.
Yeah.
My slides. Can you see them?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. It's nice to see you again. Ahmed, pleased to meet you, Prof. Naidu, and all friends on the panel. I will deviate slightly. I think I'm the only one having slides here. I guess my area of work, where I come from, is you're quite a visual people, less loquacious than most of the speakers here. So you rely on pictures to tell a story. So I would just like to set the conversation in the context of where we are. I think, as most of the speakers have mentioned, that COVID will come and go, but the bigger challenges that we face in the 21st century on a large scale, which, yes, you might call it the fourth industrial revolution. The term, I think, has been used quite a lot, just was coined by Benioffson and McAfee, who were tasked by Klaus Schwab. Effectively, he gave it one single definition. But nonetheless, whether we call it the fourth industrial revolution or the digital quake, we know we are riding an exponential that is going to change the future of work, and the impact in South Africa, which is historical inequalities, is there. It's already palpable for us that, you know, the bank tellers are no longer there. The bookkeepers have been replaced by pastel. There is a digital quake, an exponential we are riding, we are sitting on, almost like a ship riding a wave. So there is this wave that you are riding on. Its impact on how we govern, how we take decisions, how we parent. As a parent of young children, I think that there has been an outsourcing of my parenting to TikTok with teenage girls, you know, that a new parent has come and taken over our lifestyle. So it's a kind of a different way I am parenting now than some of you who are baby boomers here. So already we are what are called, I spoke to one child psychologist, fourth industrial revolution parents. Parents that actually, you know, are actually co-parenting with the ether. And that actually has been brought to right front and center by COVID itself, that it actually changed the way we parent, and the impact, a huge impact has had on gender. I mean, I'm sure that many scholars in this panel have realized that actually all the gains we've made over the last 20, 30 years, both here and abroad, might be upended by this digital quake because of online learning, especially online tutoring for young children, with women academics taking a heavier load. So that actually are the kind of the big challenges every, I think, university administrator across the world ought to worry about. That these are the challenges that in a way, COVID has force forwarded to us. It actually has moved what you thought was up there. Granted, I had very sound critiques posited by the two speakers, in particular, Salim, who actually said, online is not a panacea. People learn by interacting with each other. Universities are there to create a sandpit for young people to explore their ideas and experiment among themselves. I mean, experiment in a positive way. I mustn't be misinterpreted there in terms of, you know, being challenged with new ideas from their own backgrounds, get exposed to different backgrounds, and they need to be quoted not out of context there. So I think that, you know, we are in the midst of a crisis. I think I'll not talk about post-COVID downturn, but also there has been a lot of alienation, which manifests itself in all what, you know, what happened in the United States and across the world, and inequality. And I do believe that whether you like it or not, there will be an exacerbation of inequality, especially in a country like ours. This inequality is manifest even in California. If you go to San Francisco, where the valley is, where you've got basically a young freshman engineer coming out of Stanford earning 250,000 rand, they displace people who were old residences, which is why if you go to the valley now, you find a lot more homelessness, right? And that will have, you know, an impact globally. So therefore, digital concentration creates inequality not only across the world in the north and south, and gender in particular, which I'll give examples of, also within the countries that are actually at the heart of this digital quake. So I think that, to me, picking up from where the two speakers have left off, is that we need great minds at great institutions who will interrogate this and say, hey, you know, stop this train, let's think it carefully. How does it impact? It's not about tech, it's about us. We must be able to drive this tech. So, I mean, this is just basically what I've plagiarized, this book by Thomas Friedman. It's a very simple book, it's not technical. It just speaks about something that, you know, comes out of one of the think tanks that Google came up with in terms of where we are. I think we have to take cognizant of the fact that we are living in a digital earthquake exponential. Our institutions, I mean, talking about the institutions that we have here, the universities, were, at least in their current extant form, were established as medieval monasteries around 1,000 years ago or so, give and take. Obviously, there were other institutions prior to that within various civilizations in the Middle East and also in the Far East and India and also in Mesoamerica. But those that actually are part of what has informed our thinking are about 1,000 years old. Those are the times when, you know, we were as human beings ahead of technology, ahead of what drives us. I can tell you right now that I'm carrying here an iPhone 9, which is 3 years old. That iPhone 9 had more power than 1,000 engineers that put together what is called the Apollo Guidance Computer, the AGC, which did all these complex maneuvers of the moon, maneuvering, docking, undocking, landing, uttering those immortal words, and coming back safely to Earth, done by 1,000 engineers. And now an IX-9, which is basically 3 years old, has as much power as 1,000 computers, that a million computer is a million times more powerful than the computer that took 1,000 engineers to build, that landed human beings on the moon. So, I mean, you're living in a very strange type of complexity. Therefore, once you start to take a step back and think of the numbers, you realize that human beings are actually having to play catch up. The most Byzantine institutes that don't change are our institutions. Their very nature are complex. If I was to pass a policy document to say, I want to start something on, I mean, you've heard my Vice Chancellor writing strongly about that, a new course on digital arts that merges engineering and the creative arts, it's going to take 4 years before I have to go through all the Senate subcommittees. 4 years down the line, things have moved. And I think you need to come to the realization, therefore, even our very fundamental institutions, Salim, that you worked at before, whose name I will not mention, they need to adapt this exponential. So we are, in a way, caught in that, but that's not the topic of the day today, is that I think you've seen this. I think actually there's a lot of also, hackneyed expressions here about the emerging and declining economies that is probably can classify as, the usual WEF Davos conversations. But yet it is there, but one cannot also throw that away. But as I close, crucially, you look at this picture here, since this is about transformation. What does this picture tell? I'm sure you all know these people. These are people that have changed the face of the 21st century economy. Sometimes someone once said that we have moved from medieval, when our universities were established in medieval times, landlords, the old landed gentry had power. That was feudalism. Then with the industrialization around the mid 18th century, late 17th, late 16th, mid 18th century, the rise of capitalism that Weber spoke about when he visited Chicago, particularly manifest with the rise of the big capitalists in the United States. I think we are now, if I can provoke, in the era of datarism, right? I mean, Satoshi Nakamoto are the engineers in Tokyo who gave us Bitcoin, and these people. What is wrong about this picture? This picture is wrong because, that's how now money has shifted from having the old capitalists at the top. Now you've got datarists at the top, data capitalists. You have a huge gender, racial, and geographical asymmetry. This is the world we live in, a world that almost replicates the inequalities of the past. What do we do to ensure that we balance that? We try to, correct for that. To me, at the heart of it is the knowledge question. It's a big decolonization project here. What is this picture also telling us? This picture correlates 100% with what you saw before. Stanford, MIT, California, Institute of Technology, and so on and so forth, Oxbridge are manifest here. And that is how this knowledge power generates into basically political, social, and institutional power that is upending the way we live and interact. This is the amount of papers indexed by the Web of Science or any other bibliometric indices like Scopus and so on and so forth. You can tell that this map tries to replicate the geopolitical map of the world or physical map of the world, but it shows you the role with that little appendix at the bottom there of Africa, Southeast Asia, and broadly the global South. So the general knowledge question manifests itself into the picture. Who controls the new means of production, which is private data, is what is a big challenge facing us as universities of the global South, because this actually is a big inequality question that we need to grapple with. And these challenges require more than just technical solutions. There are social questions, social justice questions, and also there are largely economic and political questions requiring incredible political will for them to drive it. So just to close, this is where we are. My ending slide basically is a provocation to say, you know, excuse my language of using quantums. I'm a quantum physicist, I guess. I couldn't help it. But we need to think as policymakers and as university administrators how to influence government, how to make that step change that will ensure that we do not just simply extrapolate from the past and try to create a future without, you know, in a world that is non-linear. I think that's where I will end with this last statement. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Zablon. On to Di.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you, Ahmed. It's fantastic to be here, and thank you to USAf for inviting me to be part of this intellectual panel. As the bureaucrat amongst everybody here, I might come at this a slightly different way. You know, we've entered into a situation recently which seems to be very disruptive. But I just was reflecting in preparing for this this panel on, you know, a time when I was struggling to conceptualize what the role of the national department should be in steering or supporting higher education and higher education change. And a colleague told me that I should remember that universities have existed for 1,000 years or more, whereas governments and departments come and go all the time. And, you know, our role may not matter all that much. It really is at the institutional level that change has to happen. Of course, we have to be thinking about that from a national level in various ways because of the imperative to deal with some of the aspects of our country and our system. But I suppose one of the things that comes out of that idea is that universities, particularly public universities, however much we might say they might be underfunded or there's a problem with this or that, have lived through challenging circumstances throughout history and have continued to exist. And not just exist, actually have been driving forces for research and for change in the world in general. So just in terms of reflecting on South Africa more recently and our higher education sector, we've been living through various disruptions for quite a long time. I mean, if I just reflect back to being at university at Wits in 1975 and 76, there were disruptions, and we went through all kinds of different kinds of processes in this country into our democracy, and then we entered into an era of institutional mergers and change. We've seen a changing nature in our student bodies across the board, depending on, you know, in all our institutions actually. This introduction of various kinds of quality assurance models and the NQF, enormous time of recurriculating all our programs, protests and disruptions, the fees must fall movement, all of these different things. So we've been living with this on a continual basis. And I mean, maybe even reflecting on the issue of what does it mean to decolonize our system. It's not something new, but what's happened with the COVID pandemic is that, and I suppose it was something unprecedented. We weren't expecting it. And it hit us unawares at a time when we thought maybe we were chalking up some successes for the development and transformation of the system. I mean, I take the point that, you know, transformation is a very slippery word, and it gets bandied about in all kinds of different ways. But we have been growing the baseline of funding for our institutions. We had a huge injection a few years ago, and now suddenly we're in a situation where funding is very difficult because of the fiscal situation economically across the world, and in South Africa particularly. We've seen various kinds of process to try and create a more collaborative system. And I really do thank Rajeni for her very insightful comments about the importance of, that distinction between competition and collaboration. We've seen it. We've seen institutions running after so-called rankings, wanting to become world-class institutions, and in doing that, creating fragility within the system itself. So maybe just reflecting on the point that you'd asked us to reflect on as well, Ahmed, was, we've been in a situation where disruption and complexity have become a new normal quite a long time ago, I think. But COVID catapulted us into a kind of new normal. And it really makes us question whether there is anything such as normal. What would it be? What could normal be in this situation? And certainly we've seen this issue of, having to move into emergency teaching and learning modes, having to create some kind of business continuity in our universities under very trying conditions. And of course, we've seen this incredible outpouring of collaboration and cooperation across the system, which I think is something that's different from what we'd seen before. So when we start talking about developing sustainable, resilient, higher education institutions, I'm not sure what that means for us, given the kind of I suppose, situation that we've been in for quite a few years, and the move of higher education, well, particularly in South Africa, into thinking about the role of universities in a post-school education and training system as well. So what does this all mean for our sector within the context of post-school education and training, locally and globally? And, what does it mean when we are still struggling with reversing the challenges of apartheid identities, while we've been trying to ensure responsiveness to our core mandates in higher education? And again, we talk glibly about teaching and learning, research, innovation, engagement, and so on. But really, these are important aspects and threads that we have to be thinking about building in our system. During this year, we had to enter a sort of emergency mode of working. And it's not just in South Africa, it's across the world. And somehow, all institutions have managed to do that. All institutions, albeit differently, have done this. And it's not actually about online learning. I think this idea that everybody got into online learning is perhaps a bit of a myth, particularly in our context. There were certain institutions that had the ability to move quite quickly onto utilizing various platforms. And all institutions did develop platforms. But some of our institutions have been doing different kinds of things. They've been rotating people through the university, for example, to deal with issues linked to the COVID. So somehow we've survived the year. But survival is not what we're looking for as we go into the future. And I think we have to really guard against going into survival mode. I think as institutions, we need to be clear that, when we go into survival mode, we're focusing on the short term. We're creating emergency processes. We actually are in some ways connected into fear-based thinking. And really, I think we have to move out of that and understand that in stressful times, we have to, we have to actually be thinking about how we communicate with one another, how we create and embrace a collaboration across the sector. And even this notion of resilience, I thank you for Salim for problematizing it, because, you know, the idea that we're going to recover quickly, we're going to bounce back, we're going to somehow end up managing situations, in some ways kind of suggests that we want to go back to what it was. You know, we want to go back into shape, spring back into shape. And I don't think that's where we need to be going at all, because what we've learned from COVID is some of the real difficulties that we have in our system that have really been highlighted, the fault lines in our society, the fault lines across our institutions. And I think, you know, as was said by somebody earlier, and I'm not sure exactly who it was, but the issue that we, you know, while we say that we've done very well, we've got huge differences across our institutions and within our institutions. It's not a rosy picture, really, but what it's done is it's challenged us to really think through what the effects have been and how we might be able to deal with this. And I think in doing this, we also have to reflect on some of the kind of key challenges around higher education. You know, people have mentioned this already, the issue of trust in higher education, the contested views of the nature and role of universities. What are our universities for? What are they good for as well? How do we and I don't think it's balancing, but it's really how do we create the quality across the system that enables us to develop the kind of trust, not only in by the external bodies, but also inside our universities by some of our absolutely key stakeholders, our students, for example. One of the things we've seen with the disruption around in our institutions is this contestation between management and other actors within our higher education sector. The whole issue around you know, what we teach and how we teach and who teaches it becomes even more critical as we go forward. The technology disruption that we're talking about, I agree, it's not a panacea, and I can't see us going on to purely online forms. I think we have to be thinking about how do we utilize these technologies in different kinds of ways, and how do we create the platforms that will enable the kind of interaction. And that's why, for me, the idea of hybrid blended learning as we go forward is going to be a critical thing that we need to be thinking about. And honestly, if we think about our context and what we've seen over the last 8 months or so, the issue of being in the 21st century in a digital time, really, but the great inequalities, the fact that all of our students aren't actually, it's not an expectation that everybody should have a digital device, that everybody should be able to be connected into systems. I do think that's a change that's going to have to happen in our institutions. And it's not to say we're all going to be living virtually and online, but everybody has to have access to that in order for institutions to be able to go forward post-COVID. It was very interesting to me to find out that in some of our institutions, even academics didn't have access to mobile digital devices to be able to engage effectively during this period of time. So those kind of inequalities are really critical, and this idea of inequality and social justice, I think, within our institutions becomes an absolutely critical one. So we've been struggling with this for many years, and what we've seen with the COVID is how this has become more stark than ever before. So how do we deal with that? How do we think about this? The issue of the inequitable patterns of access and participation, retention and progression for staff and students, institutional cultures, racism, patriarchy, classism, gender-based violence, xenophobia, and institutional inequalities, all of these kinds of things come to the fore. And as we think about this, and we talk about quality in the system, and what does it mean in Zeppelin, your little comment there about how long it takes for us to do anything in higher education. How do we move? How can we be so responsive when it takes so long to even develop a new program in the system? But we have to be thinking about what do we mean by quality teaching and learning, and how do we move the system in terms of the way in which we engage in research and engagement. And again, I think it reflects back to this issue of competition and collaboration as we change, and we try to think about resilience. I don't know if it's resilience, but developing a really strong higher education sector that's made up of strong higher education institutions. And I think we have to face the fact that all our institutions are fragile at the moment. I think that is correct. So how do we move from there?
You start rounding up.
Yes. So I'm just thinking about 4 other things, but while I round up, the one is around obviously the financial sustainability, and what we mean by sustainability more broadly. The issue of infrastructure and how we utilize our infrastructure in our system, how we manage that and develop it. And I'll respond, I'll maybe talk a little bit more about that later. The relationships between our institutions, the world of work, and in the economy, and the partnerships, and the issue around collaboration and competition, and what our institutions need to do in order to support the system. Thanks.
Thank you, Di. I'm sure you will all agree we've had a rich and interesting set of inputs. I'm surprised that we don't have any questions. It may be something to do with the nature of the Zoom platform. It may say something about the new normal, that we are unable to engage when we sit in front of webinars and so forth. We are arranging, and Patrick may be able to tell us a bit later, so that people can engage directly by raising their hands and asking questions. But and there are many participants, there are about 80 people participating, while people gather their thoughts, I thought I'd try to distill 2 or 3 issues which the panelists can think about. I think the issues that have been raised are clearly big issues. The issues of the purpose of university, which was also raised this morning, both by the minister and Ahmed Bawa. But what concerns me is, Salim said we had some consensus, at least I think he said that, in the early 90s. I'm not sure there was a consensus. There was an easy consensus post-apartheid to agree broadly on the direction of the system. But as you started moving towards the implications of that policy, the implementation of that policy, the sort of divisions in the system started. And in a sense, both Rajani and Salim are talking about a social compact. But how do we arrive at a social compact? And the issue of differentiation is an unaddressed issue 20 or 30 years down the road from the time when the CHE first reported it. But how do we arrive at a social compact which involves institutions, the stakeholders within institutions, and the broader society and the state, when it seems to me that institutions themselves, the leadership of higher education itself, does not have an idea of is not united about the purpose and going forward where the system should be going. And that raises issues of competition. It's interesting, in South Africa, there isn't any state-sponsored competition. The market, in terms of institutions, rankings are not something that government looks upon as in other countries and favors institutions and pushes institutions to participate in the global ranking systems, etc. All of that is done, I suppose, in the name of institutional autonomy by institutions themselves. And even market competition is at the margins. Who do the institutions compete for? If you want the big institutions, the research institutions, and someone that's knocking at the door of becoming research institutions, compete for the best and the brightest students, but they're a small number. We're a small system. And if we're going to address the issues that Zebulon raised about participating in the global knowledge, if Africa is going to become bigger in that map that he produced, well, unless we recognize that given the size of the system and the capacity of the system, that unless we come together and work together across the different institutions, we're not likely ever to address the knowledge issue that he was raising. And in many ways, it seems to me, we tend to focus, or we thrive, on crisis and on fads. So we had a crisis in 2015 around Roads Must Fall, decolonization. For a moment, institutions engaged with the whole issue of decolonization, of the curriculum, etc. But that's dissipated. Students are no longer raising it. In an institutional setting, I suspect there's very little real work other than some institutions that are being funded as usual by donors, Mellon, to name one. And so they're participating in projects. But it seems to have fallen off the agenda. So the new agenda is blended learning. How serious blended learning may well have an important role to play in terms of addressing the access and success issue. But how fundamentally are we thinking about blended learning and its implications for teaching and learning in the South African context? I suspect blended learning, as I think Salim said, will become a technocratic solution to some of the challenges that we face, without really interrogating what it means and how it can be used to address the challenges that we face. Because I'm sure there are ways in which, particularly given the size, massification, and so forth, blended learning can play. Similarly, with the fourth industrial revolution, we're talking about leapfrogging and developing the country through the fourth industrial revolution without looking at our context. You know, in the 90s, in the policy work we were doing then, there was a lot of discussion and debate, largely coming from COSATU at the time, around post-Fordism, and that the education system needed to be restructured, the school system, because the Fordist assembly line was a thing of the past. We need to look at team building, working together. Well, post-Fordism has come and go, and we still haven't even sort of sorted out the Fordist problem in this country. Southeast Asia, which focused on Fordism, has grown in leaps and bounds. So I fear we're in a similar fad. And just to end, I was in a recent conversation, the presidency, I may or may not know about this, has commissioned work on the impact of COVID. The Ali Mazrui Center, where I sit, has put forward a short proposal. In engaging with them on the proposal, the question that was being asked, well, how are we going to make all our institutions become like UNISA? It's not even clear to me. So do you see how the fad becomes blended learning, becomes online learning, becomes UNISA, and how are we going to transform all the other 26 institutions or 25 institutions into UNISA-like institutions? So there's a very real danger we don't engage seriously and honestly and think about the long term. I think the minister said this morning, there's a lot of short-term thinking, short-termism in South Africa. And I think we need to engage and think more carefully about how we go forward in that sense. Patrick, are there issues or questions or people raising hands?
You should be able to, I'm not sure if people are raising hands yet, but there are a few. Let me get up, if I can just read them out to you, that'd be right.
Okay, that's fine.
Zim is asking, could the panelists speak to the structure, not infrastructure, changes that may be needed in order to build resilient institutions? By resilience, I don't mean maintaining what is currently in place, but embracing what needs to be changed and adapted, and including what's been missing to date.
Okay.
Another
Why don't
question.
you go through the other two questions as well? So.
Okay, Denise asked another one. Some of the glaring inequalities for example, disproportionate inclusion of women in leadership layers in institutions, for example, what structurally has been a barrier to women taking up their equal place in higher education? And then there's a question from Shireen Matala. COVID-19 has put into sharp focus the deep structural inequalities in our society, which are replicated in the differentiated higher education landscape. There have been a number of innovative practices during COVID-19, which seems to be shared, so collaboration is key here. It does seem that the vision, mission of universities will change. How will this affect teaching and learning in our institution, from curriculum to new modalities? What are the opportunities and challenges presented by hybrid, online, and blended learning, including the decolonization focus?
Thanks, Patrick. Well, it's open to the panelists. Shall we just do it in the order that we started? Salim?
Yeah, sure. So thanks,
And you
Denise.
can respond to what the other panelists have been saying as well.
Yeah, so thanks, Denise. And I think it's an opportunity to just clarify when we speak about structural, So the sociologist in me wants to simply remind us, that when we speak about the structural, we're not talking in a descriptive sense, A house has a structure. When we're speaking structural, we're talking about underlying foundations. We're talking about social relations, And that's the point I'm trying to make, that, as much as the massive technological changes that are about to hit us, which I think Professor Vilakazi illustrates very well, and that we need to get our heads around, COVID has not changed the fundamental structural situation in the world or in South Africa. The underlying relationships remain capitalist, patriarchal, racist, and so on and so on. And our universities must not forget that. We need to address those structural issues, and we can't do it on our own because we are limited by what the political economy for our society makes possible or not possible, right? And that's where, I do feel that sometimes we are not being honest with ourselves, that we are trying to pursue this kind of, inverted commas, transformative. And I agree, the white paper, every time I read it, I'm blown away by how transformative it wanted to be. But we've had a very unsupportive macro political economy within which the HET itself has had to work, and so on, So what does it mean then if we have an agenda that is directing us towards becoming more equal, more responsive, and all that, but in a context where, we are not supported adequately as universities, right? So that's what I was saying, that, be careful about taking resilience and sustainability being about entirely new things that COVID has thrown up. Yes, of course, COVID has thrown up things, but I think it's an old challenge. And I'm always reminded, and I'll end off here by saying, the previous president of Teachers College Columbia reminded us some years ago that in the early 1800s, a time of massive industrial revolution in the United States and so on, they had a commission, the Carnegie Commission, to look at how universities should adapt to the industrial revolution. And it's memorable what the commission ended up saying. It says, that was the wrong question. The question was not how universities should adapt to the industrial revolution. The prior question is, what are universities for? What are the purposes of universities that allows you to engage? Because we are not a state department. We are not a school. We're not a hospital, So unless we have a clarity of what our purposes are, what we are for, we can't really engage with those issues. And then I think there's the danger that in a society like South Africa, we are asked to take on all kinds of things that we don't have a hope really to really address on our own. Absolutely, we must contribute as part of the social purpose of universities, but to ask us entirely, for example, to be responsible and to end gender-based violence, when that violence is not a university issue alone, it is permeating our society. To address inequalities when inequalities are permeating our society, and macroeconomic policies in this country have not really contributed to addressing them. Then we say universities must solve all those problems. Universities are on a hiding to nothing, So I think, yes, Denise, we must take those structural issues about the underlying relations within we work very seriously, because they are still there. And COVID has exacerbated that, as we are, you know. So what is our role? What is our purposes as we come out of COVID? It's some of those old issues, I'm afraid, still, but having to be tackled in new ways in a context where inequalities could grow post-COVID. And the challenges that Professor Vilakazi is pointing out are not going to go away. They have massive implications for our society.
Thank you. Rajani? Do you want to add, or you're muted at the moment? You're muted, Rajani.
I'm sorry. So just to say, I just found everything that the other members of the panel said really, really interesting, and the questions as well from the audience. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing. Pierre Bourdieu, who did this big study on higher education in the French system, one of the things that he came up with is that inequality, the relationship between how universities contribute to inequality is not on a one-to-one basis. So individual universities don't contribute to inequality. It's the system as a whole. And so I think in terms of Denise's very important point about structure, I think it's really important to look at the system. And I think one of the worst policies in Britain was to change the binary system, was to bring all, you know, different types of universities that had very, very different missions together. And they all then played by the same rules. They all went by the same funding. And what we saw is this huge spread of advantage and disadvantage. And of course, students from the most vulnerable financial and social backgrounds ended up in the least resourced universities. And we now have, as you were talking about, Ahmed, the doctoral program in higher education management, where we have, and Di will know about this, representatives from many of South Africa's universities. And those two cohorts, we have 57 participants, and they are amazing to work with, because all of them are so wanting to change the system, and they're wanting to create research that really has an impact. But one of the things we found is that the amount of resources across those universities is just incredible. There's some universities that have very few library facilities, no internet structure, and so on. And I think that's something that we really need to do something about, to level that playing field a lot more, while of course not destroying what we already have. And I don't pity anybody that tries to do it, because it's kind of easy for us to analyze as academics and researchers, but when you're sitting in those positions and you have all these limited funding and all sorts of challenges coming from all sides, how do you make the best decision? And so I think it is important to say that universities, as Salima said, can't be responsible for everything, but to pick certain things that we can be responsible for and that we can work on. And, you know, a lot of the South African students on our DBA program have spoken about competition and the negative effects of competition, and many are looking at rankings. And when they go and interview senior leaders in university, rankings features really, really in quite a major way. And then finally, I think I just want to pick up on another point that Professor Vilakazi made. This just a really, really interesting and insightful presentation. But one of the issues is that all these companies like Google and Amazon and so on, while they are pushing forward in terms of technology and disruption, they are literally tearing the fabric away from society. They don't pay taxes, they take away jobs, they take away democracy. They are becoming incredibly powerful. And so how universities relate to these new social actors is also very important.
Thank you, Zebulon.
Thank you, Ahmed. I was just going to quip by saying that, I'm a relative newcomer in the space. I mean, Ahmed was my teacher, believe it or not, 30 years ago, more or less. And so all of you have been, we're part, when I was still a student, of the policy making. And I think I'll go back to what Professor Naidu said with that intro regarding the decision taken in the UK around 1992 by the major government of, there were police and there were unis, right? So, and I think that also can be extrapolated to here. And I think because we've been colonized, we picked up what the mother country did and almost applied it here and almost heuristically, quite frankly. And I think, what went wrong, Salim, with Guyana College of Education, right? Colleges of nursing, technicons that produced experts who actually were driving ESCOM, the guys who become our tool and die makers. We try to create a homogeneous something, and probably to answer the question by Denise Zin is maybe we need to ask ourselves. I mean, it requires a lot more rethink and reboot of the computer to say, did we do anything wrong when we were trying to reconfigure? Obviously, it's part of our learning curve. Obviously the world and the world economy has changed by and large. So I think that is something that I wanted to actually pick on, raised by Professor Naidu, and also, and just have the humility to actually admit, that this was to use a scientific metaphor, was a wrong experiment. Let's say you get a new bench and start again. So I think that's kind of my provocative response to what to the nugget dropped by Professor Naidu. Salim, the issue around, for example, universities that they can do everything. I mean, as a vice chancellor of VETS, I mean, I'm now really faced with issues you mentioned that universities actually, I mean, to do what society do. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. Universities must be nuggets, must be beacons that society must aspire for. You mustn't reflect society per se. We can't solve society's problems. We cannot deal with crime. We don't have the monopoly of violence, organized violence rather, that the state has, right? But we should, at least in terms of policy, in terms of actually not having issues of violence, of lack of debate, of crass way of argument on our campuses, entire society, to quote from some politician I don't like quoting, but I thought I'd like to quote Reagan when he spoke about America as a shining light on a hill. That's the only role we can do to change society. That's all we can do. That's what Athens did. That's what all the places of learning do, to actually make society look at us and say, these places of higher learning make us aspire to be better citizens. And I think that's where that's how I will respond. Just the last one on rankings, which every bureaucrat I'm guilty as charged. Whenever VETS comes up in some ranking, I'm the first to write an op-ed and blah, blah, blah. And I think I'm guilty as charged. Mia maxima culpa. I will say that actually it has been the most corrupted system, not in the context of people stealing, but in a sense that the original ranking came from Shanghai with Li and Chen. Those of you that remember those emails that came to our inboxes. To do what? For the Chinese government to say, how do you benchmark our kind of C9 system against the best in the world? There was a very innocent attempt at just saying, using a very, very crude measures, scientifically doubtable, even mathematically out of kilter with our understanding of statistics, just crude measures, just to say, where are we? And then came the entire industry around after that. Thank you, Ahmed.
So before Di comes in, can I just, because she may want to respond to this, given that she's created all the problems in the first place. But some of the policies that we introduced, Salim refers to the white paper, the creation of universities of technology, the mergers and so forth. We did it in the context where we assumed or didn't think carefully about the capacity we had to implement the policies. We were often running ahead of our own capacity to do so. And sometimes, we like in this country also to say we're the best in the world, or we've got the best policies in the world, but our capacity, our institutional capacity, and our ability on the long term to think about change seems to me a key problem, not so much that our policies were always wrong. I have to defend some of what I did in the past, but I don't think we thought enough about what it means to do what we were trying to do, ambitious as it was. And I think it's coming home to roost at the moment. But maybe Diane, Salim, and others can come back on that point.
Thank you, Ahmed. I mean, I suppose, you know, we can always look with hindsight and say that what we did had unintended consequences, because I mean, we know why we moved that way. And it wasn't actually about not creating a system that should be in some ways differentiated. Okay, not albeit not like the CHE had indicated. But I think the issue of capacity development is an absolutely critical one that we do need to think about. And its capability, actually, its capability, I think it's about capability of people, of organizations, of systems. And Denise, you know, while we're talking about the structural inequalities and the structural problems, and I think it's clear that those are not about infrastructure per se, we also do have to understand what the infrastructural issues are around developing the space for strengthened higher education. I mean, I don't want to talk about transforming the higher education sector, but we are talking about how do we move the system so it is more collaborative, so it is more cooperative, so that it has a better chance of success for everybody, and we end up with dealing with some of the enduring inequalities, both structural and infrastructural, within our system. So I do think this issue is a critical one. I mean, our department currently, just to reflect on what you said there, Ahmed, the Department of Higher Education and Training has quite a large staff, actually, because we've taken on the whole TVET system somehow. I don't know how the department ended up actually directly employing everybody in the TVET system, but that has happened. And the capacity to manage that is a real problem, I think, for the whole sector. And in higher education itself, I mean, we have a very small department, a very small branch, to try to follow and to work with and to so-called steer and oversee what is the largest part of the department. It's, you know, if we look at the total funding for the system, we're talking about 107 odd billion. And when we talk about the higher education part of it, including student funding for higher education, we're talking about 72 billion. So you can see there that kind of issue. And so what I think we've tried to do in more recently is to say, how do we use the system itself to help us develop the system? So Rajeni, you were mentioning the fact that there are 57 South Africans on this BARS doctoral program that has been funded by the department. And what that is about identifying possible future leaders for the system. And then saying, how do we find a collaborative, cooperative partnership between our institutions and the University of Bath in this case, to look towards supporting and enabling these future leaders to become better, or to gain access to the kind of knowledge that will enable them to change the system. So the whole aspect of saying, how do we develop, how do we create, how do we transform? We don't do that by some kind of policy decision or something we say. We rather do it through working through partnerships, working with the system. And that's been the whole philosophy. And Salim, you will remember you you came to us with your next generation of academics program, and we kind of didn't accept it as it was, because what we were thinking then was, how do we create a more comprehensive thing that looks across the different ways in which we need to think about people, infrastructure, organizations, and systems? And how do we create the capability inside the institutions to deal with that? And of course, it's not enough. But certainly we've seen we have seen some movements with the kind of collaborative programs that we've put in place across the system. So as we're talking about what we mean by transformation and what we think about that, I mean, we've kind of conceptualized this in terms of trying to move from a state of vast inequality, huge fault lines across the various dimensions, whether it's race, class, gender, disability, patriarchy, culture, language, knowledge, all of those different things, which were hallmarks of what apartheid was about. It was the legacy that we came from, through to working towards quality, and quality in terms of the various aspects: teaching and learning, curriculum programs, research engagement, leadership, management, governance, all of those different strands, and trying to find ways in which we can support institutions to collaboratively work on those, to develop I don't want to call it capacity, it's capability. And of course, resources are a critical thing, but it's not the only thing. I really think leadership is absolutely critical in this. Thank you.
Can I just direct you to two questions? The one which we haven't answered is, what are the challenges and opportunities that blended learning provides given the South African context, including the challenges of the school system? And secondly, it came up this morning about the role of partnerships. What is the role of the private sector or private higher education? Who wants to go? Salim?
So I can start with that the private sector, because you'll recall that in 2000, the CHE organized this major conference in Sandton, where we brought the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Public Works, many people, including the private sector. We worked with Bobby Gotzel and others. And it was a disappointing outcome because, to be honest, it also reflects on the nature of the private sector in South Africa. The private sector is as short-term as government, to be honest. It's about a rapacious accumulation of capital, or the export of that capital.
So I'm also talking about private higher education.
Yeah, sure. Private higher also. So unfortunately, not much came out. And, you know, some of the leading lights, who I will not embarrass here in terms of the private sector, whispered to us to say, you're not going to have a lot of joy. There are not many people like me who really think about, you know, South Africa and how the private sector could be contributing and so on. So that is still unfinished business in terms of, you know, what the private sector sees. All I read is that they are talking about skills and more skills, and skills for the fourth industrial revolution. It's never anything beyond that, about the citizenship aspects and so on, right? So I think, you know, we also need a deep conversation with the private sector again. And the private sector has been speaking a lot about a major reset, to quote a tycoon. I'm not sure the reset he's talking about is the reset we need in this country. You know? Okay. So the private sector, as far as I'm concerned, you know, as much as they have supported scholarships and so on, have not really been partners, either with the state or universities, around some fundamental issues about what are universities for and what role can the private sector play in that regard and so on. As far as private higher education is concerned, you know, I've just read a 50-page, very good chapter on private higher education as part of a monograph that's coming out soon. And I had to point out in that very good chapter that brings us up to 2020 in terms of what is existing in private higher education and so on. I think there's a paradox there, or a contradiction there. On the one hand, they are saying that you have not taken us seriously enough. They are critical of the DHET not taking them serious enough. But at the same time, there's also self-pleading to be treated differently from public institutions. Now, I think they must be treated differently because they're not public institutions, but their differential treatment is related to almost that all these public good imperatives that we have, all these transformation objectives we have, we can't be seeing them contributing in the same way. So what does it boil down to? Oh, you mustn't force us to provide private higher education in science and technology. It's too expensive. Or if you want us to work in that area, you must provide scholarships like you do with NSFAS and so on, which is something that should be discussed, right? So I think the private higher education sector also needs to think deeply. You cannot have it both ways. On the one hand, you say you are open to contributing to the public good ideals and so on, but we must be spared a whole lot of other commitments that go with that, right? And that is has to become part of the compact. If you are part of a compact, the point of departure of the compact is these goals that we have to change South Africa and change higher education. And you cannot then be pleading to be exempt from some of those commitments that you have to make, towards those goals. So that's what I see as a fundamental contradiction. Otherwise, a very good paper, that I enjoyed reading and commenting on and so on. You need to do a bit of thinking as private higher education. You can't be both ways.
Okay, who wants to go? Zebulon, Rajani?
Yeah. Just to pick up on the private sector, I think, Salim did allude to a compact. I think we still need to do the compact. I mean, I wasn't at the conference, so I never would understand what the reset button is. I'll give you data, anecdotal example here of, for example, around 1990, Anglo-American had De Beers research labs that supported university research, SASOL and everything. Actually, we had done in-house research. All those labs have have actually decoupled from the country and are in Ireland. So therefore, imagine the amount of IP that was lost. SASOL as well has moved elsewhere. If you look at government, in defense of government, if you look at government investment in higher education, the function of the OECD yardsticks, you remember them, of the 2.2. It's actually government has come to the party through the DSI and through other investments. It's actually the growth expenditure, which actually that's where the gap lies. It lies with what we had in the past, in the late 80s as government intervention in all aspects of R&D in the country. So therefore, I think if there is a reset button, that's where it must start, at least from the point of view of just pure on the contribution to the national good growth expenditure. I worry as well if, as you've seen in the case of the United States, where there is a kind of a compact, more or less, science, I didn't know more about. When you've got private philanthropies funding research as well, there was a concern among physicists about the rise of, I know Neil is a very good friend of mine, the Perimeter Institute, and all these privately funded institute. Research must be must be led by government. That was a concern. So therefore, how do you balance the two, to me, is a concern, where someone says, oh, I'm a multi-billionaire, I wanted to build an institute for research. Public accountability gets lost. So I don't know how to get the balance between the two there. Finally, on the online, I think the blended learning. I can give you, maybe you can call me a typical positivist, typical scientific positivist, is that you can have successes. Things like MOOCs that were totally out of kilter with, they came out of good ideas, from MIT, and they thought that they were going to enable everyone to have access to a Harvard degree, but obviously not. It was basically housewives in Germany who wanted to get back to school, and the throughput rate was low. But in a blended format, when you are introducing a new concept in South Africa, you don't have faculty for that. I'm using faculty in American term, academic staff. So therefore, the staff, the academic faculty can be the interlocutor between, what is a course that is offered elsewhere. So that is, and therefore they can help students access that course without them having to. I think that, to me, is where I believe that in a very smart way, blended learning can actually bridge the gap, because we don't have teaching staff in South African universities of 50 people, right? Who have got name chairs after them. You've got limited staff, and the ratios are not good enough. So therefore, we'll need to copy paste and adapt it to our environment. And the MOOCs that you've been involved in through edX have been very successful in that regard, and they've been contextual as well. Thank you, Ahmed.
Rajani, I always give Di the last word because she speaks for his master's or mistress's voice.
So, I mean, I think it's kind of both a disadvantage having been out of South Africa for so long, but also an advantage. So I can look back at the, you know, the first kind of emanations of what would it be to change the higher education system straight after Mandela came into power and so on. And I think the big difference there was we really thought that we would have some form of at least a strong welfare state or some variant of socialism. And of course, South Africa is not even a weak welfare state. So the kind of external socio-political conditions have changed very, very dramatically. And us old style political activists who were political activists in that era find it really, really difficult, to understand why the students who are talking about fees must fall and decolonizing the curriculum don't see us as in the same boat as them. We're allies, we're not your enemies. But actually in this context, we're not really allies. We've kind of moved positions. So I suppose we need to reflect much more on where we are, what our assumptions are, and what the new context is. And the social compact that we build needs to really understand this shift in the socio-political position. But also, I think what's useful about the fact that I've been away is that I can look and see the changes, and there are massive changes and very positive changes. So I think it's kind of useful for us to also say, look, we've done this right, we've done that right, we've done that right. But these are all the big issues that still need to be tackled, because otherwise you just feel disillusioned and you feel that everything you've worked for and everything you've tried, you still end up in the same kind of reproducing inequality through no matter what you do. And I think it would be, and I'm just thinking about, we were involved in a project in ESRC and NRF project on looking at how undergraduate students, their success and their access, and how that related to the public good in higher education in South Africa. And one of the things that I mentioned is that the South African researchers were not saying, look, we've done this differently and we've done this better than Britain. And there were many instances, for example, where equity and quality is linked in South African perspectives and policy and so on. So I think there's a lot that other parts of the world can learn from South Africa. And maybe, you know, one of the things we've done in Bath recently at my university, because we've been looking at the decolonization of the curriculum, is we've looked at what people are doing in their courses. And I think there is so much going on in South Africa about the decolonization of the curriculum, from arts to engineering to science. And if all of that can be put together in a platform for all South African universities to share, but also for the rest of the world to share, that would be quite a positive step forward.
Di?
Thank you very much. So maybe just first about the private higher education sector. I think that in South Africa, we do have a growing private higher education sector, but it's relatively small compared to the public, and it has a different role to play. Currently, we have around about 135 private higher education institutions. Most of them are fairly small. They mostly have a single focus in a niche area. They're often linked to a particular industry. And where they have really got a strength in some cases is the direct link into that industry. So they're kind of in some ways are playing a role that our public higher education institutions are necessarily playing, but it's also because they're mostly undergraduate focused institutions. So they are far more focused on the world of work and the kinds of qualifications that are linked to that. Yes, obviously not the most expensive qualifications that one runs, but some of them are, particularly in the film industry. And then we have a few that are possibly will become universities as we change our policy towards that. That are have got a broader range and focus in terms of postgraduate and undergraduate mixes and a broader range of qualifications. So the private hire has an important role to play, but it's a different kind of role to the role that that public universities play, because they don't take up that role towards the I suppose we've talked about it, universities being a public and a private good, but particularly the role that universities have to play within the intellectual and research community. Now, whether or not we can invest in private education, which is profit making after all, mostly, is something that if private higher education expects the government to invest in private education, then perhaps it has to have a different, some different focuses there, and there may be. I think there's room for that change. Understanding what how these are regulated becomes really important, and perhaps it's in the same vein that we need to perhaps rethink the way in which we fund our public institutions to support them more effectively in terms of the need to have the range of institutions dealing with society. I think it links also to the fiscal situation. We've got a really difficult fiscal situation at the moment in the country. We're not in a situation where where we can right now fund our institutions in the way we should. And I mean, it's one of my biggest concerns actually for the future of higher education is how government will invest in higher education and research in the landscape going forward. We've seen over the past year how we had our budgets cut in higher education, not as significantly as some of the other sectors, but still it was significant. And we're looking into the future. We don't know how we're going to be able to manage that, and there's going to be a need for all institutions to think carefully about how they manage those aspects. So that brings me to this whole issue of blended learning, and why blended hybrid forms of learning, I do think, are going to be the future of higher education. I don't think we can go back to a colonial view of higher education where we sit in a classroom one-on-one all day long, or part of the day, go and read and then come back. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, currently we've got a very strange, prior to COVID, many of our undergraduate qualifications were delivered in large lecture theatre groups. What is the point of having everybody in a large lecture? It may be better to blend this in different kinds of ways. And it creates all kinds of opportunities for the way in which we actually decolonize our institutions, and we rethink the way in which we utilize our infrastructure and create spaces for learning. And I think from that perspective, there's a lot of possibility in this, but we have to be creative about it, because we have to take into consideration the pedagogic aspects. It's not just a technical issue that you have IT system and everybody's just going to get on the IT system and learn. I don't think that's how it's going to work. It's going to have to be, how do we blend that personal, real contact that's required to change minds and to create the kind of interaction, the social relationships that can do that. But at the same time, utilize the power of the technology that we have in terms of being able to provide this kind of thing. And I can see in the future, we're not going to require huge lecture theatres in the same way as we required them before. I think we've got to be thinking about the in-between spaces in our universities as learning spaces. We have to be thinking about how do we create those opportunities for students to interact with each other and for everywhere learning in some way or another, and then also create the contact in spaces that are actually smaller and more intimate. So I do think that there's a huge change that we're going to see, and part of this will only happen if we take it up, if we have the leadership to take it up. Take another example of institutions. I mean, certainly from the infrastructure program we manage in the department, we've seen it. Institutions want to start a new program. The first thing they want is a new building that might cost 300 million. And why do they need a new building like that? Because there are hundreds of buildings at the university which are sitting fallow. In fact, our research is showing that most buildings are used about 40% of the time during the day. So what does that mean? We have individual academics wanting to have their own rooms and own them. This is a whole change here in terms of how we think about this being brought on, in fact, forced on us in some ways through the way in which we're having to deal with some of the challenges that have been highlighted by the pandemic. Thanks.
Okay, can I pose two questions? One is to Zebulon directly as Vice Chancellor Designate. And in the context of the discussion we had earlier about rankings and the fact that, as Rajani said, that differentiation by mission is not valued, is there a possibility? I know your current boss, the Vice Chancellor leaving, mentioned somewhere that he was open to the idea of the sector as a whole withdrawing from the ranking system. Is there such a possibility? Because that would have a major impact in the way we think about going forward. The second question is somebody raised about the social compact. What are we doing about it? Where are we going? I mean, is there a moment now, not because of COVID per se, but that we may want to rethink the future of higher education in the way that we did with the National Commission in 1995 or whatever? That there's a lot of ad hoc task teams and committees and commissions we set up on specific issues, which DAI has to manage often. But is there a time moment now that we need to get back and say, given all of these changes, both the challenges, things that have worked and not worked, and also given the sort of broader post-secondary education system, the TVET colleges and their link to higher education, that we may want to go back to the drawing board and rethink a reimagined higher education system through a national commission of some sorts. Now that's open, and we can have your final comments because we're going towards the end of the session.
I think you asked me the first one, the unfair question rather, on the rankings, which I'll answer in a short while. But I think, from what Diane said about buildings, and I'm going to point this at Salim as well, and every VC the world over, or president or prof or rector the world over. I mean, VCs also, like French presidents who've retired, need to leave a building behind, right? It's part of the VC. Come on, Diane, give us a bit of something. We've got a tough job. One needs to have a bit of a toy to leave behind, like a large library, a large structure. But I thought I'd just quip in a very, but I think seriously speaking on the rankings, is that the first law in Physics 101 is the law of inertia. Once something is set in motion, you can't stop it. I think that, I know Adam spoke about it, but the sectorial withdrawal by South Africa will not be helpful, because it's like us withdrawing from the from Elsevier and so on and so forth. I showed you the graph. We are but 1%. So therefore it will be, I think, not wise, if I can dark it. So, but we mustn't be, our mission drivers mustn't be about rankings. And I shouldn't be the last to talk, but I will leave it at that. I think I leave the rest on the policy issues to my colleagues here.
Okay, Salim.
So my views on ranking are well known. I've written about that in peer-reviewed articles. And so let me just leave it that I'm not persuaded by Zebulon, because I really think rankings are corrosive. They're corrosive to the knowledge project because they are based on the worst kind of social science. How can any self-respecting university take rankings seriously when we know how weak their social science base is, you know? And that it's all about reputation for the wrong reasons. And they can create huge distortions. Right? So let's leave that aside. Let's come to the second issue, Ahmed. So, you know, I simply remind us that one of the things the CHE said in 2000 is that the size and shape exercise is not forever. That in 20 years' time, maybe we have to go back to look at the size and shape exercise again, right? And it is 20 years since then. So, you know, maybe a social compact comes out of an exercise like that. It deeply takes stock of where you are, takes on board perhaps your observation that perhaps sometimes it was not about policies and so on. It was really about the weakness of implementation. And implementation itself stymied by the lack of funds that the DHET has had to support the changes. So one classic example, we said over and over again, this new landscape, and especially the historically Black universities, if we want a differentiated system, there must be genuine developmental trajectories for the historically Black universities. And as much as money has been put into the HBUs and so on, with respect, it's just not been enough to bring about the kind of changes that we need to bring about in the HBUs. When I was chairperson of HESA in 2011, we agreed. We did a massive report, right? We agreed that there should be no difference at undergraduate level between any institutions. If there are 5 microscopes per student at WITS, there should be 5 at Fort Hare, right? So I doubt we have even equalized at the undergraduate level because the challenges have been so great. And and I will take the point, yes, leadership matters. Some institutions have done better because they have reconciled themselves with the fact that they don't want to be a research university like WITS. We don't need 25 WITS. It would be a disaster in this country to have 25 WITS, no matter the important role they play in the research arena and so on. So I think maybe, you know, a social compact comes out of a commission of some sort that takes serious stock about, you know, where are we? Is the shape right of the higher education system? Do we have to go for a harder differentiation? Because every year Vice Chancellor, it seems to me, still wants to become the Harvard or Oxford of South Africa, when we don't need that many Oxfords and Harvards, right? How do we really do this? And I think, you know, we need a lot of honest stock taking amongst the leadership of universities. And I don't mean the DHET, I think amongst vice chancellors and amongst the councils of universities, about are you prepared to embrace a mandate that ensures that you are a high quality undergraduate institution, which takes its pride from how many students you have that are accepted at the so-called research universities, you know. So that differentiation issue is bedeviled by financial issues. It's also bedeviled by articulation issues. We haven't sorted that problem out also. So maybe this is a good time to take stock, especially given the COVID pandemic, and recalibrate about, you know, where we are and so on. And then as part of that, to answer one of the questions also, yes, you know, the sociologist in me doesn't want to have a firm definition of what transformation is. The sociologist of me does not want to have a firm definition of what institutional culture is. But, you know, unless you have a working definition of what is institutional culture and transformation, how do we change things? I think it becomes over clever among some academics about, you know, we must leave everything loose. We must not enforce a definition on transformation and institutional culture and so on. That reminds me too much about scoundrels, you know. You don't want to pin anything down because you don't want to be held accountable. And you don't want to have to answer, how have you transformed and so on. Last point I'll make, you know, Diane, you're absolutely right. You know, I remind people that some of the challenges we have today is not because of failures, it's because of success. And we should celebrate that. You know, Raj, Jenny, you make that point. We must challenge ourselves without demoralizing ourselves. And to constantly say everything is rubbish and no change has happened is just not untrue. Some of the problems that we're having right now is because we have moved from 400,000 students to 1.1 million. That's a revolution. 58, I mean, I've just been reading all these chapters, you know. I think there's a chapter that's got to be written, and I'm trying to encourage some people to say, we haven't celebrated the achievements of women yet. We have done remarkably post-1994 in terms of what our women have achieved through higher education. 59% enrollments. It's only at the doctoral level that women are not adequately represented. At the level of staffing, we almost have 50-50 also, not at the senior levels, you know. So some of the challenges we are facing now are a product of massification, is a product of the growth of our system that has put up new challenges. And those are good challenges to have. We shouldn't be shy of those challenges, you know. So I think, yes, we should be celebrating some of the achievements also after 25 years. Not everything is in a kind of catastrophic or, you know, dire state.
Okay, Rajani. And you need to unmute, Rajani.
Make three quick points. The first one is about ranking. And I think it's interesting, there was a new type of classification that came about. I don't know if people will know, which is called multi-rank, where universities were not ranked, but actually there was information for stakeholders, for governments, for students. And that was not successful. And the reason that wasn't successful is because the most powerful universities in the most powerful countries basically opposed it. So the issue that we're going to face is because ranking works for the most powerful because of the criteria that ranking uses, that there'll always be this kind of protection of ranking, even though it makes absolutely no sense at all, especially in terms of how the criteria are measured. But I think there still should be a way in which we should try to oppose ranking. And I want to look at the example of the publishing. When publishing, there were certain publishing companies that had huge monopolies, and they were really taking resources away from academic publishing. They really had a stranglehold on the whole system of research and innovation. And so countries like Germany and the Netherlands and the universities in Germany and the Netherlands got together and opposed these big publishing companies. And that was actually successful. And, you know, at the start, people said, this is just the way the world is and we can't do it. So I think Zebulon may be right. We may end up absolutely nowhere, but I still think that we should really try to come together and oppose some of these really insidious competition mechanisms. The second point I wanted to make was just to talk a little bit about decolonization of the curriculum. And Ahmed, you will know that at Kanye College in 1985, 86, we were all very, very young. We had no teacher training, and we basically—
Speak for yourself. I'm still quite
young. I had no teacher training. Oh, sorry, the young.
The young part, yeah.
We're still quite young. But we really had to go in and teach these hugely kind of talented students, and we had to learn from them. And so we developed the curriculum by working with, you know, the UCT and WIT, with community organizations, and by listening to the students. And at that time, we had the space to do that, funnily enough, during the apartheid era. And I think it would be really interesting to take some of those lessons of how the curriculum was developed into our discussions about talking about decolonizing the curriculum in the present period. And we need to move away from these kind of quite simple notions of the local versus the international, indigenous versus non-indigenous, because things have become more interrelated and things have changed so dramatically. So I think part of the decolonization of the curriculum could actually be looking much more at how does local and international interrelate. You know, when we talk about the Western canons, actually, you look more closely at the Western canons and you'll see how non-Western cultures were actually just appropriated and then spoken of as Western. So I think that would be a really interesting way to go forward on some of these issues as well.
Okay, thank you, Di. You have exactly 1 minute to 3:30. Then we have to close off.
Thank you very much. I won't take long. I mean, I think this issue of ranking, just to make one point, I do agree with Salim completely and with Rajeni. And one of the really interesting books that came out, when was it, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, Chris Brink's Soul of the University, talks about this in various kinds of ways. And I think one of the things he stressed in that book, if I remember correctly, is the idea of, universities being good at something, and then, what are they good for? And that holding those two things together around developing, I suppose, in some senses, reputations for what they're good at, and being able to work within social their social responsibility, I suppose, and responsiveness in terms of engagement. And I do think that we need to be thinking more about this as we go forward. And it links into the whole issue of differentiation for me. It's that issue of mission and mandate, that different institutions need to actually identify those things and then work towards that quality in whatever focus it is. And certainly from the department's point of view, when we engage through our enrollment planning mechanism, which is an old mechanism that is there, we have been trying to move towards that, but it hasn't been completely successful, and it needs to be looked at how we can make those social compacts more in place. And linked to this idea of the size and shape exercise, I couldn't agree more. It is something that we embedded into the long-awaited national plan, but the idea that we have to really think about, and that's within the PSET system itself. What are the different kinds of institutions? What are the different kinds of campuses? And how effective is it to have some of these mega institutions that we have in our country? I'm not suggesting we go into a whole new merger, demerger process, but it's something that we do have to think about. And when we talk about the institutions that are stressed, a lot of the stress and the fragility isn't only internal. Yes, management is important, councils are important. I think governance is critically important. And then also the actual context in which those institutions are located. I mean, we've seen it in stressed institutions where we talk about being anchored in place, we talk about engagement with the community, but where the municipality is falling apart and there's no electricity and bulk services and water, it's really a difficult situation for institutions. So it's not just about what we do internally in higher education, it's also about how we create that and recognize what higher education can do. And then just one last thing on councils. I do think that when we first came up with the transformation white paper 3 and the kind of thinking around cooperative governance and the creation of councils in the particular structure that we have, we were thinking in terms of a different kind of social situation and social compact, and I'm not sure that our current structures are really the kinds of structures we need to support the kinds of institutions that can really do what we hope they will do in terms of these purposes that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to 3:30, end of our session. It's been very interesting and insightful. I'm sure we can carry on talking about this for the rest of the day. I would suggest that we send a copy of Chris Brink's book to all of the VCs I think it should be required reading about rankings for them. I've been asked to indicate, thank you to all the participants and to the panelists. There is a plenary session apparently. I'm not sure what time it's starting, probably 4 o'clock. And everybody is welcome to join that session later on. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.